Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Those of us who are fasting, maybe getting into that giddy stage at the end of the day and looking forward to breaking the fast later. Let's light up the darkness. The fast today, for anyone not familiar, is the 17th of the Hebrew month of Tammuz. And that's 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, when both the first and second temples were destroyed. And on this date, 3 weeks before that date, this is when the walls were breached by the Romans at the 3 weeks before the destruction of the second temple, and we remember that. Some say that the same exact thing happened with the Babylonians breaking through the walls of Jerusalem 3 weeks before the destruction of the first temple, which also happened on Tisha B'Av. And there are some other calamities in Jewish history also on this date. This is a minor fast because it's meaning only the daytime fast. We didn't start fasting last night. One could get up, like 4:30 a.m. this morning and have a bite of breakfast before sunrise, as opposed to Tisha B'Av in 3 weeks, which will be a full 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur. And we will not have class. I told you I would look that up. On Tisha B'Av, we won't have class. Some opinions hold that you can learn Torah in the afternoon on Tisha B'Av, but most say no. So we won't have class that day. It's great. We're even now running a day ahead, so perhaps that'll be the day when we just skip a day and get back on schedule. But interestingly, what I had forgotten is that the day before, Erev Tisha B'Av, right? So in 3 weeks minus a day, you can't learn Torah in after Hatzoros, after halachic midday. Not everybody holds by that, but we'll observe that. So the day before Tisha B'Av, which I think is going to be on a Tuesday in 3 weeks, the day before on Monday, we'll have that class at noon, special time noon. So that we're not violating that practice of not learning Torah on the late afternoon before Tisha B'Av begins. Okay, let's get to it. We are holding now on chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1. And our daf today is page 29, but we pick it up near the bottom of page 28b. Oh, and I didn't even welcome people. Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Texas, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Tom in PA. Sharon, are we not having class on Monday night or Tuesday? When it's, I think I explained it, right? So we'll have class Monday afternoon before Tisha B'Av in 3 weeks. Monday at noon, and then no class on that Tuesday. Jonathan in SoCal, Shandora in the Bronx, Aoife in Florida, Ellis at Shalom, Marjorie in Georgia, Elanit in Silver Spring. Yes, exactly. This is the day also when Moses came down, found the people engaged with the golden calf, and smashed the first set of tablets. That was on this day. Okay. So like I said, picking up near the bottom of page 28b, continuing our discussion yesterday about a chazaka, a presumption of ownership established by somebody living in a house or working a piece of commercial property, whether it's a bathhouse or an olive press, an orchard, a vineyard, a farm, etc. So if he's been living in it or living on it or working it for 3 years, according to the majority opinion, so then he is the presumed owner of that property. He has to be able to tell the story, make the claim that he bought it legitimately from the previous owner. But then if somebody shows up after this guy's been occupying it for 3 years and says, well, no, actually it belongs to me, then the newcomer with the claim will have to prove his claim. And in the absence of being able to overcome that burden of proof, the one who's been occupying it for 3 years will remain in possession, right? So that's what it means to have presumptive ownership. It means that to be dislodged from there, somebody would have to prove that you don't have a right to be there. Hold on a second. Okay. Now, and then what we were talking about at the end of yesterday is, well, there's an opinion that says, even in the Mishna perhaps, that according to a minority opinion, you could establish that presumptive ownership not only by living there for, or let's say a vineyard, not only by harvesting the produce there for 3 continuous years, but if it was like a sort of combination vineyard orchard or an orchard with different kinds of trees in it, so if you brought in 3 different harvests, an olive harvest, a fig harvest, and a pomegranate harvest, that might count at like 3 years, you did 3 harvests, even though it could be done in 1 year, that might establish presumptive ownership. It's minority opinion, but some hold by it. And now we continue this discussion. Now, this is as we learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yishmael says, in what case is this statement that 18 months are required for a non-irrigated field set? Right, so an irrigated field, that's where a person has to be working the field, making sure that the water is running through it. Non-irrigated means that there's enough rainfall for the type of crop that is being grown there so that it doesn't need to be irrigated. And so this is where we had this idea that you could have, be on it for a portion of the first year, the full middle year, and a portion of the third year, and that would count like 3 years of residency or 3 years of usage. But that's only for the non-irrigated field, said Rabbi Yishmael. Now, with regard to a white field, and white in this context means a place where grain is grown, with regard to a white field, a grain field, is where this was said that you could do a partial first year, full middle year, partial third year. But with regard to a field of trees, once he gathered his produce and then harvested his olives and then gathered his figs, 3 different harvests, this would be the equivalent of 3 years, and it could be done in 1 year. So Rabbi Yishmael is of the opinion that 3 harvests are sufficient. And the Gemara asks, according to the rabbis, the majority opinion that disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael, and who hold that 3 years, not 3 harvests, are required to establish the presumption of ownership, what is the source for the concept of this type of presumptive ownership? And Rabbi Yosef said that it is written in the verse detailing the purchase of a field from Hanamel by Jeremiah, his cousin, during the time of the siege of the land of Israel. This is Jeremiah 32:44, quite apt for 17th of Tammuz, where Jeremiah was prophesying that because of all the sins of the nation, the temple was going to be destroyed. He was referring to the first temple. And sadly, tragically, his prophecy proved to be correct because the people did not repent and mend their ways. So as that destruction was approaching, Jeremiah said, men shall buy fields for money and subscribe the deeds and seal them. So what does this mean? This describes the writing of a bill of sale to serve as proof of ownership of the field. Why? Because he was unable to remain living there for 3 years to establish the presumption of ownership. Now, in Jeremiah's case, perhaps because he has to travel the country acting as a prophet, but also he's talking about a time where the land is going to be overrun. As the prophet Jeremiah stood in the 10th year of King Zedekiah's reign, and he warned the people to write bills of sale for the 11th year, when the land of Israel would be overrun by the hordes of Nebuchadnezzar. So consequently, despite the fact that one purchasing a field there would be able to live on the land for 2 years, this would not be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, which is why he said that they should have bills of sale written. No one was going to be able to be on the land for 3 years continuously to establish his ownership. So he said, you better not be relying on 3 years of ownership to establish your presumption of ownership. You better have, a written bill of sale to record that this is your land because bad times are coming. Abaye said to him, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, perhaps there in Jeremiah, he merely teaches us good advice, that it is advisable to have documents to preclude the need to present witnesses that can attest that one had been living on the land. This is not a proof that presumption of ownership cannot be established in less than 3 years. Rather, Jeremiah was just giving good advice. You don't want to have to litigate your ownership. If you buy a piece of land, make sure that you have a deed, that it's recorded in writing, in presence of witnesses, etc., so you don't have to litigate the ownership later. Now we're on 29a. Because if you do not say so, if you do not say that Jeremiah was merely giving good advice rather than establishing a legal principle that it requires 3 years to establish presumption of ownership, then when Jeremiah states, quote, build houses and dwell in them and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them in Jeremiah 29:5, well, what halakhic statement was he saying there? So rather, he's just teaching us good advice. He's not decreeing a matter of law through prophecy. He's just giving good counsel. And so here too, he teaches us good advice. And the Gemara comments, know that this was advice and not law, as it is written, quote, and put them in an earthen vessel that they may continue many days. Jeremiah 32:14. This is obviously good advice to preserve the items properly, and it is not a statement of halacha, it's not a statement of Jewish law. Therefore, this is not a proof that the presumption of ownership cannot be established in under 3 years. We haven't proven that yet. So rather, Rav has said a different reason. A person who sees another profiting from his field might waive his rights during the first year, and he might waive his rights for 2 years, but he will not waive his rights for 3 years. Therefore, if one does not lodge a protest by the end of the 3rd year, it is tantamount to a concession that the land is not his, right? So somebody says, well, this field is mine. This guy is coming on and working on that field and taking the produce. I don't really care. I wasn't going to work my field this year anyway. I'm busy with other projects. Let him do it. It's okay. And then the 2nd year, you know what? He made a profit for himself last year. This year, again, I'm not working the field. I'm not going to say anything. In the 3rd year that guy is doing that, it occurs to me, oh my gosh, this guy thinks he's going to do this every year from now on, and he's going to think it's his land. No way. Now I will speak up, right? So this is a kind of psychological observation that Rava is making. Abaye said to him, if that is so, when it becomes clear that the land is in fact owned by another, and it is returned to its owner, it should be returned, save for the produce that the possessor consumed during the first 2 years, as the owner waived his rights to it. Right? So when I speak up and the land goes back to my possession, do I also have a right to collect the value of the produce that this guy grew on my land during those first 2 years? Didn't I waive it? So then why did Rav Nachman say that when a piece of land is claimed and the claim is found to be a valid claim, the land is returned to its owner and the produce is returned because that guy shouldn't have been farming on land that wasn't his. So rather, we don't have a proof from this, people just waive their rights for 2 years, but they won't waive it for 3. Rather, Rava offers a different reason. A person is not particular the first year to lodge a protest, and he is not particular for 2 years, even though he does not waive his rights to the produce. He is particular to lodge a protest when he sees another profiting from his field for 3 years. Therefore, if one does not lodge a protest by the end of the 3rd year, it is tantamount to a concession that the land is not his. It's not so much about waiving rights as it is about knowing that you have to lodge a protest in order to keep your land. So Abaye said to him, if that is so, for people such as those of the Bar Eliashiv household, who are particular, even with regard to one who goes on the boundary of their field, meaning they're litigious people, here too, will you say that presumptive ownership is established immediately as soon as one makes use of their property without their lodging a protest? Since they are known to be people who lodge a protest when anyone encroaches on their rights in any way, if they don't lodge such a protest, do we say, okay, well, it must be that they are not going to lodge a protest, they've waived their rights, and that person has presumptive ownership immediately? Because in this case, the owner is known to be one who lodges protests right away, and he didn't lodge a protest? And if you would say that, indeed, that is the law, well, if so, you have subjected your statement to the varying circumstances of every case, as there will be a different length of time needed to establish the presumption of ownership depending on who the prior owner is, whether he's a litigious person, one who is prone to lodge protests quickly, or not. And we can't say that we're going to have a different standard of how long it's going to take to create a presumption of ownership depending on the litigious habits, the litigation habits, the protest habits of the previous owner. This is untenable. So Rava tries again. He offers a third explanation for how we established that 3 years is the amount of time for presumption of ownership to be established. Says Rava, a person is careful with his document detailing his purchase of land for the first year after the purchase, right? He created a deed and he stores it very carefully for a year, and he's also careful for 2 and 3 years. For 3 years, he's not going to lose that deed. For more time than that, he is not so careful, and he might discard the document if no one has lodged a protest concerning his possession of the land. Therefore, the sages ruled that after 3 years have passed, he can prove his ownership by means of presumptive ownership, because the sages, in a very realistic manner, said we can expect people to hang on to important documents for 3 years, but after 3 years, the way of people is that they lose documents, and at that point, we can say there was a presumption of ownership established. Abaye said to Rava, if that is so, a protest that is lodged not in his presence should not be a valid protest. And if 3 years pass with no protest in his presence, presumptive ownership should be established, even if there was a protest lodged, but it was not lodged in the presence of the person who's currently in possession of the land. In other words, somebody lodged a protest, but they lodged it in court, and nobody got around to notifying the guy who's living on the land right now that a protest has been lodged against you. Since he didn't hear of any protest lodged against him, after 3 years, he thought, well, okay, the document doesn't matter anymore. I'm firmly established here. And when he does spring cleaning, he, carelessly allows that document to be thrown out because it's not so important, because nobody lodged a protest as far as he was aware. So if it's just that we're saying that somebody, should need to worry about keeping those documents as long as no protests have been lodged in the first 3 years, therefore we should require that if a protest is lodged, the guy who's living in the house be notified of it, right? The protest is lodged in his presence. And this is because the one possessing the land can say to the claimant, if you had protested in my presence, I would have been careful with my document and I wouldn't have discarded it. Now the Gemara explains that this claim cannot be accepted because the claimant can say to him, listen, your friend has a friend and your friend's friend has a friend, and things get publicized. So if somebody lodges a protest in the court that you're living illegally on this piece of land, you eventually would have heard about it and you should have heard about it. So, we lodged the claim in court and that has to be good enough. And that's where the discussion ends. Now, new subject. Rav Huna says the 3 years that the sages said are required to establish the presumption of ownership is referring to when this person in possession of the land worked and profited from the field in consecutive years. And the Gemara asks, what is Rav Huna teaching us with this statement? We learned in the Mishna their presumption of ownership is established by use for a duration of 3 years from day to day. That's how the Mishnah was worded. So the Gemara answers, lest you say that the phrase from day to day serves to exclude partial years and to teach that each of the 3 years must be full, and actually even scattered, i.e. non-consecutive years are sufficient. Therefore, Rav Huna teaches us that the years must be consecutive. It's not that you lived there for a year and then you left and then you came back and lived there for a year and then you left. And then in the 7th year, you came back and lived there for another year. And you said, well, I lived here for 3 years. Nobody objected. This is my land. No, it has to be 3 consecutive years. Rav Chama says, and Rav Huna concedes with regard to locations where they leave the fields to lie fallow by planting in alternate years, that the 3 years combined, despite not being consecutive, as that is the manner in which owners profit from the land. If it is the custom in that region that a field is planted 1 year, fallow the next, and then planted the year after that, those would count as 3 consecutive years, even if he didn't plant in the middle year, because he was following the custom of that region. The Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is the law? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to state this with regard to locations where there are some people who leave the fields to lie fallow, and there are some people who do not leave their fields to lie fallow, and this man left the field to lie fallow. Lest you say that the claimant can say to him, if it is so that the land is yours, you should have sown it for 3 years in a row. Therefore, Rav Chama teaches us that the possessor can say to the claimant, I am not able to hire someone to guard one parcel of land with an entire field, and I acted like those who own other land in this location, and I let that parcel lie fallow as part of my ownership of that land. And alternatively, the possessor can say to the claimant, in this manner of farming, it is beneficial to me to farm, because the land produces more later, and I do not wish to plant year after year and weaken the soil. That's why I let it lie fallow. Now, the Gemara clarifies Rav Huna's statement that the presumption of ownership can be established only by consecutive use. We learned in the Mishnah about the presumptive ownership of houses. But with regard to the use of houses, where the witnesses attesting to its use know who uses the house only in the day, but they do not know who uses the house in the night, how then can one establish the presumption of ownership in that case of a house? The possessor's use is not consecutive, as it is continually interrupted by the nights. He's brought witnesses to testify that he was living there for 3 years, but these witnesses only saw him living there by day. How do we know that that he was living in the house at night? Obviously, it makes sense that he was there day and night, but the witnesses only saw him there by day. So is that going to be enough to establish the presumption of ownership? Abaye said, who testifies about houses? Neighbors. And neighbors know who is inside in the day and in the night. What do you mean that they only saw him there by day? If he's the neighbor, he knows whether this person was there day and at night. Rava said that there is another scenario in which one can bring witnesses with regard to the use of a house, and this is such as when two people come and say, we rented the house from him, and we lived in it 3 years, in the day and in the night. Now, this testimony substantiates that the house was used under the authority of the possessor, who is attempting to prove that he has established the presumption of ownership, right? It's not that the guy who claims he bought the house 3 years ago has been living in it for 3 years. In fact, he bought it and then he rented it out, and he's been collecting the rent from the renter, right? Now, that is somebody who is using it in a profitable way for 3 years, so this counts, and the people who are living in the house can act as his witnesses that they have been living in the house and that they rented the house from this guy who claims that he bought it 3 years ago. But there's a problem. If they're going to act as witnesses, there's a problem if they're going to act as witnesses because they're in a business relationship with one of the parties to this litigation, right? The new claimant who's coming along and saying, hey, you never bought that house from me. This is my house. This was my house. I just, I got in trouble. I went to jail for a few years, but now I'm back and I never sold this house. And the guy who is claiming that he bought it says, well, I bought it 3 years ago. Nobody objected. I rented it out. And here's the witnesses who can show that they've been using it under my authority for 3 years. Now, Rav Yemar said to Rav Ashi, how can their testimony, the renter's testimony, be relied on? These witnesses are biased in their testimony because if they do not say this testimony, that they rented the house from the possessor for 3 consecutive years, we say to them, well, go and give payment for the rental of the house to the one who is claiming ownership, as the one you paid has not established that he is the true owner, and they might have to pay the rent all over again. Of course they're going to say, hey, the guy that we paid rent to is the legitimate owner. So Rav Ashi said to him, low-level judges rule this way. In other words, only a court composed of ignorant judges would accept the testimony of the renters of the house in a case where they are biased in their testimony. Nevertheless, Rav's scenario is still possible where we could use the testimony of these renters. How? As are we not dealing with a case where they haven't paid the rent yet? They are holding the money for the payment for the rental of the house, and they are saying to the court, to whom shall we give it? Therefore, they are not biased in their testimony because they will pay the same amount regardless of who the actual owner is. And what we're litigating is who is going to get the payment of these renters. Now, the Gemara quotes a related statement. Mar Zutra said, and if the claimant, right, the one who's coming to try and dislodge the one in possession of the house, if the claimant claims and says, let 2 witnesses come to testify for the possessor that he lived in the house 3 years, in the day and in the night, then his claim is a legitimate claim. Now on page 29b. And Mar Zutra concedes with regard to peddlers who traveled through cities, during which time others might live in their houses, that even though the claimant does not claim that he insists on testimony that there was continuous use day and night over 3 years, we, the court, will make this claim for him. Since people know if they are traveling salesmen, it is more likely that people lived in their houses without permission and without their knowledge. So with regard to the requirement for continuous day and night use to establish the presumption of ownership, the Gemara comments, and Rav Huna concedes with regard to a store in the town of Mechoza, which is generally used in the day and is not generally used in the night, that one is not required to use it in the night in order to establish the presumption of ownership. Now, with regard to the requirement of continuous use to establish the presumption of ownership, the Gemara relates that Rami Bar Chama and Rav Ukva Bar Chama purchased a slave together, a female slave, maidservant. So one sage made use of her during the 1st, 3rd, and 5th years, and one sage made use of her during the 2nd, 4th, and 6th years. One individual who contested their ownership, their partnership of the maidservant emerged and claimed that he was the owner. Of course, very difficult for the modern ear to talk about slaves, just being negotiated, bought and sold like property, but that was the way of the ancient world. So they, these two guys partnered to buy a servant. Presumably, neither one could afford just to buy the servant by himself. And then, so she was the maid and the cook or the laundress or whatever for years 1, 3, and 5 for one of the guys, and years 2, 4, and 6 for the other guy, right? So she once a year, she would move from one household to the other. And then after this had been going on for 6 years, somebody showed up and said, well, I don't know where you got the idea that you own this slave. She belongs to me. I never sold her. Maybe she was kidnapped and then sold on a slave market. I don't know. But the original owner comes forward and says, that's my slave. Now, wait a minute, where are we? So they came before Rava for judgment, right? So this original owner claiming that he still owns the slave is the claimant, and the ones in possession, the two sages, Rami Bar Chama and Rav Ukba Bar Chama, presumably brothers, both sons of Chama, who bought the slave in partnership, they are the possessors, right? They are the defendants in this litigation. So they came before Rava for a judgment, and he said to them, to the Chama, the Bar Chama brothers, what is the reason that you acted like this, making use of her in alternate years, so that each of you would not establish the presumption of ownership concerning each other by making use of her for 3 consecutive years? In other words, they could have made a deal. Okay, well, she works in your house for 3 years as a slave, and then she comes to my house for the next 3 years. And they didn't do it that way, because if she was in the first household for 3 years, then there would be a presumption of ownership by that brother, and the other brother might not be able to dislodge her and bring her to his house. So instead, they alternated years. So Rava says, so what you did by alternating like this is that she was never in one house, in one location, for more than a year. So you didn't establish a presumption of ownership vis-a-vis each other. And just as this usage does not establish the presumption of ownership with regard to you, right, between the two of you, it also does not establish the presumption of ownership with regard to others, i.e. the claimant in this case as well, which is interesting because between the two of them, they certainly could, it seems like they established the ownership, right? They had the slave working for them for 6 years. But because she changed home, once a year, they never established a presumption of ownership. And now the claimant, who maybe can show evidence that he was originally the owner, now the two brothers are going to have, he has the presumption of ownership as the original owner. And the brothers will have to prove that however they came to purchase and possess her, that was legitimate, right? The burden of proof is on them. And if they can't meet that burden of proof, this claimant who now shows up will be able to take the slave home. Now the Gemara adds, and we said this only in a case where it was not written in a document that they are partners and are dividing the use. But if it was written in a document, then the document generates publicity that they are the owners of the maidservant in a partnership rather than individually, and they can jointly establish the presumption of ownership, right? Because there was evidence of that partnership. Otherwise, the slave is just swapping houses, but we don't have evidence of the partnership. We don't have evidence of the presumption of ownership. But if they had that kind of evidence, they had that kind of document of the partnership, then the burden of proof would shift back to the claimant, and he has to meet the burden of proof that these guys, stole her, or somehow came in to acquire the slave illegally, or else they can keep. New subject, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara continues its discussion of the requirement for full use of land to establish the presumption of ownership. Rava says, if one worked and profited for 3 years from all of the land, except for the area required for sowing, S-O-W-I-N-G, a quarter kav of seed, this is known as a base rova, which he did not use. So he acquires all of the field based on presumptive ownership, except for the base rova, right? So in other words, this guy is claiming, right, he doesn't have the deed. What he has is that he used this land continuously for 3 years, but there was a portion of the land which is large enough to be considered a field in its own right, which he never used. So his presumption of ownership extends over the part of the field that he did use and not over the part that he did not use. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, and we said this ruling only where that base rova is suitable for planting. But if it is not suitable for planting, then he acquires it by means of the acquisition of the rest of the land. In other words, if it's suitable for planting and he didn't use it, why didn't he use it? Maybe because he didn't own it. If it's not suitable for planting, why didn't he use it? Well, he didn't use it because it's not suitable for planting, but it is considered to be part of his land, so he would have presumption of ownership over all of it. Rabbi Bar Abaye objects to this. If that is so, how could one acquire an area that is only rock by establishing the presumption of ownership, as one does not plant crops on rocky land? Rather, the presumption of ownership can be established by standing animals on it or spreading produce on it. Here too, he should be required to stand on animals on that base rova to spread produce on it. If he did not profit from this small piece of land at all, he never used it in any way, then he has not established the presumption of ownership with regard to it and acquires only the rest of the field. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. One question from Bell. As I understand, the Romans, I guess, had a central depository for contracts, etc., and guarding these documents was part of the work of the Vestal Virgins. Wow, I never heard of that. Was there any such depository set up to safeguard different contracts, including ketubas, marriage contracts, at this time period? I don't know. It does seem like maybe not, because they keep talking about the need to publicize a purchase. The idea that the town would hear of it, right? And that acts of acquisition had to be done in front of witnesses. Now, I know that the Persian Empire definitely was very much into record keeping. And so perhaps there was a system, a local system like the Romans had over the land of Israel, the Persians had in Bava. And the question is, did the Jewish communities maintain some kind of parallel registry system where these kinds of deeds, would be filed and could be looked up? It's a great question. You would hope they did. I don't know. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time, 6 p.m.